Terrorism, a word many Americans fear, especially when Saddam Hussein threatens to use it. Here in the U.S., people are reacting. Airports are empty. Many are staying at home. But just how real is that threat? Just how worried should you be?
This is ABC News Nightline. Substituting for Ted Koppel and reporting from Washington with the latest on the Gulf War, Chris Wallace.
First, here is the latest on the Gulf War. The skies over Israel lit up again tonight when Iraq fired another Scud missile toward the Tel Aviv area, the first attack since last Sunday. U.S. Patriot missiles were fired at the incoming Scud, and it's unclear whether it was the Patriot or the Scud or debris from both that caused damage to shops and apartments below. At least 20 people were slightly injured. While Israel and Saudi Arabia are under direct attack, thousands of miles away here in the U.S., people are worried about another threat, terrorism. Domestic and foreign travel is down sharply. Sales of gas masks are up. The other day, former President Reagan received a package in the mail. When an X-ray couldn't identify what was inside, the package was blown up. It turned out to be a pepper grinder, a gift for Mr. Reagan's 80th birthday. Which brings us to our subject tonight. Just how worried should we be about terrorism in the U.S.? Nightline's Jackie Judd has some answers.
A blood-stained sidewalk in Adana, Turkey, where an American man is killed by terrorists. A Paris newspaper office destroyed by a terrorist bomb. An Iraqi in Manila killed when the bomb he's handling explodes. They're only a sampling of terrorist activities that have taken place since the Persian Gulf War began. The State Department calculates there have been 100 incidents in all, compared to just 40 in the same period last year. It is not clear how many Saddam Hussein may have ordered, but because there's not been a major incident and because there have been so few casualties, terrorism experts suspect that others are responsible.
Groups that have their own agenda are taking advantage of the current environment to conduct operations. I'm not talking about professional terrorists, but I am talking about people attempting to advance their own political objectives.
Still, Saddam has telegraphed intentions to strike.
Any Iraqi Arab or Muslim who is killed in carrying out guerrilla operations against any of the Allied states is to be considered a martyr.
Last month on Baghdad radio, he called for commando attacks on America and its allies. This week, cryptic statements such as report to the bank, implement all that is on the table were broadcast. It's not clear what those statements meant.
I think some of them are just psychological warfare to increase terror in the general population. But there were also among them some quite short, very specific messages from and to named individuals.
And the psychological warfare is working. People at home are afraid. The most obvious sign of that is at the airports. O'Hare in Chicago doesn't look like what it is in normal times, the busiest airport in the world.
I think that there are quite a few cancellations. The airlines have seen tremendous drops in their passenger volumes. You've seen airlines like TWA have removed part of their service to Europe and brought it back to the United States.
But it's not only transatlantic flights that are flying half empty. By some calculations, factoring in fear and recession, domestic travel is down by 60%.
If I were to travel right now, it would definitely, have me think twice about it.
I'll be traveling in about 2 weeks, and I'm trying not to think about it. But it is a fear, I think it's in the back of my mind.
One of the cities people are avoiding in droves is Washington, in the belief that it's a prime target for terrorists. Tourists normally have to fight the crowds at the Air and Space Museum. Not today. Traffic at all the museums and monuments in Washington is off by more than 10%. Is the fear keeping people away rational? Are Americans at risk of being killed or maimed by terrorists?
Really, the amount of danger they represent is a great deal less than most of the dangers one runs crossing the road in a busy city.
And statistically, that's true. But it still begs the question of whether Saddam will order an attack on American soil. There would be obstacles. support for terrorists by Iraqi embassies has diminished since so many diplomats have been expelled from the allied countries, including the U.S. There's extraordinary security in Washington and across the U.S., and law enforcement is given good marks for tracking operatives.
It's very difficult to conduct operations in this country. Generally, our counterintelligence, our law enforcement apparatus is fairly credible and fairly proficient at being able to identify profiles of terrorists operating.
However, terrorists linked to Saddam do have a track record of attacking presumably safe areas. Terrorists he has harbored carried out the shootings at the Rome airport and the Aquililaro hijacking. Cannistraro says there is some cause for concern.
There are a number of cells in the United States that could be interpreted as supportive of Saddam Hussein. I can't specifically name any other than the Abu Nidal cell, and also point to the fact that there are a lot of Hezbollah members in the United States as a result of immigration from Lebanon over the last few years.
The experts agree the strongest reason to fear that Saddam would use whatever resources are at his disposal is the enormous symbolic value of striking the enemy on its own soil. Yet the fact remains there have not been any known acts of war-related terrorism in the United States, and that raises the same question that battlefield planners are asking about Saddam Hussein. Is he not capable of launching a major strike, or is he waiting for just the right moment? This is Jackie Judd for Nightline in Washington.
Later in our broadcast, we'll look at another kind of threat here at home, as we see how prejudice and fear have affected the Arab American community. But first, when we come back, we'll be joined by the man who oversees the U.S. government's fight against terrorism abroad, and by a clinical psychologist who works in a military community and helped develop procedures for training counter-terrorist units.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by Jeep Eagle.
David Brinkley here. On our This Week program Sunday, the Persian Gulf up to the minute, and we'll talk with a Russian general who helped train Saddam Hussein's army. How good is it?
Joining us here in our Washington bureau is Ambassador Morris Busby, the State Department's coordinator for counterterrorism, whose job includes breaking the cycle of state-sponsored terrorism. And with us from Savannah, Georgia, the Director of Behavioral Sciences at the Memorial Medical Center, James Turner, a clinical psychologist who has worked extensively on the issue of terrorism. Ambassador, let's start with the central question. Just how serious is the threat of terrorism in this country? Just how scared should we be?
Well, Chris, we're facing an adversary who has a history of using terrorism and who has sworn to use it against us. I think we would be foolish not to take what he says at face value and to take the proper precautions. And of course, that's what we've been doing. We have heightened our security awareness. The airline companies have heightened their security procedures. On an international basis, we have been consulting with our allies. We're doing everything that we can to try and protect the public and to protect our facilities and our people overseas. One of the good things that comes out of all of the attention that's been paid to terrorism and the threat of terrorism is the fact that we've heightened public awareness, and I think that people are concerned about it, and we have a great sharing of information. On the other hand, I think it is a tragedy if people begin to panic and begin to think that this is something which needs to change their lifestyle. That is not the case at all, and in fact, if we begin to change our method of life, the way we do business, then in fact the terrorists have won.
Well, of course, that's the difficult question, though, for the individual. How do you draw the line between, on the one hand, being sensible, and on the other hand, panicking? And let me ask you a couple of specifics. For instance, should Americans have any doubts about taking a domestic flight here in the U.S.?
In my opinion, no. The FAA has gone to the airline companies and has been working with them for a number of months. We have the highest level of security for our domestic airline flights and our international flights in the history of civil aviation, and I think that it is perfectly safe to fly in this country today.
Should they have any doubts about getting on a foreign flight, flying, let's say, to Europe?
As I say, American flag carriers have the highest level of security that we have ever had. We also require those levels of security for any foreign flag carrier that is operating in the United States and in their last port of departure coming in this direction.
Dr. Turner, you work in Savannah, Georgia, as we mentioned, a town with a lot of military personnel. Just how scared are people about terrorism?
Well, we're beginning to see an unreasonable response to fears, fear of travel, fear of being in large crowds, and also fears about, should I distinguish my home from other people's homes? Will I become a target? And the fear is relatively unrealistic in relation to the threat that exists.
Well, you say unrealistic. Be a little more specific. How many calls are you getting at your center, and what kinds of specific questions are people asking?
Well, it's interesting. We're getting calls from the regular citizen population that you would expect to see. People who feel preoccupied, people who feel frightened, people who are wondering, should I take that trip? People are canceling trips to Europe, and certainly the precautions that American carriers have taken make those trips relatively safe. And the level of fear about those issues is certainly out of proportion to the real threat that we see.
Well, let's talk about that. You know, as we mentioned earlier, the Iraqis are firing their Scud missiles at Tel Aviv and Riyadh and Dhahran, not at Savannah, Georgia. Why is it that here, thousands of miles away, people are getting the jitters?
Well, I think one of the issues is the media has responded very strongly to the threat of terrorism without pointing out that terrorism is the battle against the hearts and minds of the people. And as the ambassador said, the more we allow terrorists to disrupt our normal way of life, the more power we give them. And that the actual strength we have to fight against them is to refuse to let our normal way of life be disrupted once we've taken precautions. And the other thing I think is the immediacy of the media coverage. There's tremendous impact of seeing Scud missiles coming in actually as they're happening and not knowing what will happen as they land.
On the other hand, though, they know that the Scud missiles certainly can't come across the ocean. When you tell people the facts, when you try to relieve them of their concerns, are they relieved, or do these anxieties persist?
Well, with some number of folks, that it's very possible to relieve them by giving them the facts, the statistics, and talking about the threat being comparable to walking down the street and being hit by a meteorite. That certainly puts it in perspective for many people. There's another group of folks, though, who have been merged with this coverage. They have come to find it very difficult to distinguish that these things aren't happening very close by, when in fact they're thousands of miles away.
Ambassador, let me ask you about another reaction that some people consider unreasonable, not by individuals but by airplane companies. Should airlines ban Iraqis or other Arabs who don't have U.S. passports or don't have U.S. residencies from getting on their airplanes? Is that justified from a security standpoint?
Well, all of the airlines, Chris, have in place at the present time profiling systems which should enable them to pick out people that perhaps might be high-risk passengers. And I think that you're referring to the single instance where one airline company chose to do that. I think that's been rescinded at the present time. There are security procedures which can be put in effect and which in fact are in effect at the present time, which should screen out those people that are high-risk passengers.
Well, gentlemen, when we return, I want to ask both of you to take a look into our nation's future and to examine just how long you think we're going to have to be living with this threat of terrorism. And we'll continue our discussion in a moment.
When our pilots go down in the desert, how do we find them? Meet the soldiers who risk their lives behind enemy lines. Search and rescue on Primetime, Thursday. Around the world and into your home, stories from people who care. When news really matters, Hugh Downs, Barbara Walters, 2020, Friday.
We're back again with the coordinator for counterterrorism at the State Department, Ambassador Morris Busby, and clinical psychologist James Turner. Ambassador, my guess is that most Americans expected, certainly feared, that at this point in the war there would already have been a major terrorist attack on the U.S. Jackie Judd asked a good question in her report at the beginning of this program. Is Saddam Hussein no longer capable of launching an attack, or do you think he's just waiting for the right moment?
Well, Chris, I think that I could only speculate on a question like that. I would like to think that Saddam Hussein is no longer capable of launching a terrorist attack, but I think it would be foolish of us to assume that. I think as long as the conflict goes on that we should maintain our heightened security. I think that we have to anticipate that they will attempt to strike at us at some point and continue to take the kind of precautions that we have.
Do you have any thought that if and when a ground war starts over in the Gulf, that will increase the threat of terrorism here in the U.S.?
Well, I can't really say. We believed and we told the American public that at the point at which hostilities began, that we anticipated that the gloves would come off and we would become the object of the terrorist attention. To date, that hasn't happened. I think that's a combination of luck. It's a combination of some very good precautions and some of the things that we have done. To my mind, I can't see why the commencement of a ground war would necessarily increase the risk above what it is now.
Of course, even after the war ends, there's still going to be terrorists around. Will this country ever return to, quote, normal? And by that I mean pre-January 16th. Or are we going to simply have to learn to live with an even greater heightened security?
You know, the key to that lies in the whole question of state support for terrorism. The sophisticated and really lethal terrorist organizations depend upon countries to provide them the wherewithal to conduct these kinds of sophisticated operations, passports, training, money, the ability to travel, and a sanctuary. I think that a lot of that will depend on how successful we are in the post-hostilities period in breaking that cycle of state support in the Middle East, where for the last 3 decades every conflict has been followed by a cycle of violence and terrorism.
Dr. Turner, will people just get used to the increased security the way they have so often in the past, as we certainly have already, to things like metal detectors?
I believe people will adapt very quickly to new security procedures. You already hear it in people planning that they need to be to airports earlier. I think they'll be very comfortable with living with this higher level of security if they feel that it does provide a significant deterrent. And I think it does provide a significant deterrent, and people will be quite happy to adapt and live with it.
But let me ask you this. Does the ever-increasing sense of threat and the ever-increasing presence of security measures to deal with that threat, does that leave some psychological scars? Does that change the way that people feel about themselves and the world around them?
Absolutely. It leads them to ask questions about things they would never have asked questions before. They think about going to large events now where they never thought about that before. They think about whether they should take that trip wherever it may be, in Europe or the United States. Certainly there will be scars and there will be ramifications, but unfortunately terrorism is something that we will live with most of our lifetime because it's a tool of the weak. And when they're not state-sponsored terrorism, there are single-issue groups that seek to make their point of view known through bombings and other kind of terrorist acts.
Ambassador, leave us with some specific tips, the kind of precautions that Americans should take both here and abroad against the threat of terrorism.
I think being aware of your surroundings, being alert, and most of all, having the traveling public and the public at large form a partnership with the security organizations and the airline companies and others who are doing their very best to try and protect them.
Well, let me be a little bit more specific. One of the things I read today was that if you're traveling, if you're on a plane going overseas, that any U.S. identification should be put into your checked luggage. I guess the idea is if there are terrorists on the plane who hijack you, there'll be nothing on the plane in the cabin to identify you as an American. Good idea?
Chris, I think if that makes people feel better, they should do that. To my mind, that's a precaution which is not necessary given the kind of security procedures we have in place today.
Is the threat much greater in Europe than it is here in the U.S.?
It's difficult to say, but the European theater has certainly been witnessed more terrorist attacks certainly than we have historically.
Dr. Turner, we've got about 30 seconds left. Any tips on how people should keep their mental health, how they should deal with what could be a prolonged period of stress?
Number one, to recognize that it's highly unlikely that they'll ever be involved in that. If they really want to be worried about something, be worried about crime on the streets, being mugged in any major city in our country, worry about things that might really happen to them and refuse to change their lives, because that's the most important thing they can do to thwart the terrorist.
Should they, this sounds suicidal, but should they turn off the TV or stop reading the newspaper?
Oh, absolutely, cut down. Maybe a news diet. Maybe not stop altogether, but they certainly need to go on a diet of news.
Ambassador Busby, Dr. Turner in Savannah, thank you both very much for joining us tonight. I think after listening to both of you, people may have a slightly more pleasant weekend.
Thank you.
The terrorist threats that we've talked about tonight can lead to fears, both real and imagined. Those fears can, in turn, lead to prejudice. When we return, the backlash against Arab Americans here at home. During war, certain ethnic groups have faced discrimination in the U.S. German Americans in both World Wars, Japanese Americans during World War II. Now, as we hear from correspondent Chris Bury, it's the Arab Americans whose loyalty is being questioned.
Detroit is home to more Americans of Arab descent than any other city. Some are recent immigrants, but most have been here for generations. Many Iraqi Americans in Detroit own small groceries. Brothers Eddie and Jake Bukal come from Baghdad. Two of their other brothers are in the Iraqi army.
Although I was born and raised in Baghdad, as an American citizen, I'm committed to United States for right or wrong.
The Bukal brothers may be American citizens, but they say they have sometimes been treated like the enemy since the war began.
Our kids have been subjected because of their nationalities. They call them camel jockey. Iraqis go home.
I'm an Iraqi born and I hold American passport, but what makes them think I'm a bad guy?
So far, the Bukals have suffered indignities, but no violence. Two other Arab American businesses here have been burned. In San Diego, a bomb was planted in a mosque but did not go off. In San Francisco, several Arab American stores were vandalized.
Since it's happened to about 12 different Arab stores in the area, I believe it's racist.
In all of last year, 41 hate crimes from threats to beatings were reported against Arab Americans. This year, in January alone, 36 hate crimes were documented. The Arab American News, a national paper, has installed an 800 number to monitor discrimination.
It's a tense time for everybody.
But the only reported incidents have been minor: ethnic slurs, broken windows, and telephone threats. So far, the discrimination against Arab Americans may be more insult than injury. But in this community, that can be just as painful. And to many here, the biggest insult is the suggestion that they may be a security risk to their country. First came word that the FBI was interviewing hundreds of Arab Americans, ostensibly to protect their civil rights, but also to ask them about terrorism. Then Arab Americans learned that Pan Am and possibly other U.S. airlines were banning Iraqi visitors to the U.S., including students from both domestic and international flights. Activists say the case reminds them of racism in the 60s. What worries Arab Americans most is a pattern of discrimination they see emerging from the war. That not only hate mongers, but government agencies and big businesses seem to be questioning their loyalty, not on account of anything they have done, but because of who they are.
We're American citizens. We love this country. That's why we're here. This is the best country in the world.
This is Chris Bury for Nightline in Detroit.
And that's our report for tonight. I'm Chris Wallace in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
If you wish a videocassette version of Nightline, the cost is $14.98 plus $3.95 shipping and handling. This has been Nightline.
Nightline is a presentation of ABC News. More Americans get their news from ABC News than from any other source.
America's watching ABC.